On the same day that I visited the Golden Spike Tower, I visited Union Pacific number 480 at Memorial Park in North Platte, Nebraska. Number 480 is a C-57 Class 280 that was built in 1903 by Baldwin as number 1901. I assume it was renumbered between 1915 and 1920 because that's when most other C-57s were renumbered. Number 480 was withdrawn in 1956 and placed here on display. There are 19 other Union Pacific 280s that survive in preservation, one that I saw in Laramie and another that I saw in Cheyenne on this trip. Seems like they replaced the footboards on the tender recently as they're still plain wood. It seems like the tender was repainted sometime after the locomotive itself was. Notice the difference in font on the locomotive compared to the tender. This warning sign is actually typed in an old-style railroad font, used on most other railroad equipment in the old days. Speaking of fencing off locomotives, this is Santa Fe number 1050, which I've seen a few times before in Lawrence, Kansas. I actually remember a time when you could go inside the cab, but nowadays you can't. Probably been like that for at least 10 years. 460's fence has barbed wire while 1073's fence doesn't. There's also this neat sketch of engine 3977 which is on display at Cody Park. I find it odd that such a small town as North Platte, Nebraska has two parks displaying railroad equipment. Wouldn't it make more sense to move 460 to Cody Park? What I really like about this sign here is that it's told by the engine's perspective. But the stenciled font is hard to read. I also find out about 480's display is that there's no sidewalk around it. Here's how far Memorial Park was from Golden Spike Tower. Now we head to the Cody Park Railroad Museum, which is on the same side of town but on different sides of the tracks. At the Cody Park Railroad Museum is Challenger number 3977, which was built in 1943. Towards the end of its life, it was renumbered 3710, but was renumbered 3977 back in 1968 when it was donated here. I really like the Greyhound livery it's displayed in, but it wasn't always displayed in that color. From when it was first put on display well into 2001, 3977 was in the same black livery that 3985 was in. It also didn't have smoke deflectors. I don't know if they were replicas or originals donated by Union Pacific. What I like about the trains here at Cody Park is that they have the headlights wired on the locomotives. On the side of the tender, right as you head up it, there's this history plate about its donation. Fortunately, you are allowed to go inside the cab of 3977, and all of its controls are labeled. Although I couldn't find the bell cord while I was in the cab, I did notice it still had its whistle cord. I didn't know if the whistle still worked or not, so I didn't pull it. Judging by the style of firebox door, this engine was an oil burner. I think I read somewhere that its oil tank was given back to Union Pacific to use on 3985. Judging by the lettering on this tank, it was hydro tested right before it was retired. I think that means they just filled the boiler with air. I like that they put this signal right next to 3977, which makes some pretty good photo opportunities, which have Union switch and signal casings. It's also a lower quadrant signal. I don't know how many American railroads use lower quadrant signals, since upper quadrant ones are more common. There's also this water column placed right next to 3977's tender. I think if it was swung, it could possibly fill the tender if it was hooked up to water. This sign here is also written in the perspective of the locomotive. I find it odd that this old crossbuck is paired with a newer one-track sign. Also on display is baggage car number 1350, which shares the number of a Union Pacific Jeep that was still in Rio Grande paint well into 2011. as well as RPO number 2069, both of which you can go inside, which I'll show you later. And there's also Caboose 25161. Also on display is Centennial Diesel Locomotive number 6922, which was built in about 1970 and donated in about 1990. Kinda like this angle I took of 6922. The side of the Centennial is a car track barcode, which was used in the 60s and 70s. Although abandoned in 1977, quite a few locomotives and cars still have car track barcodes. You also climb up and go inside the cab of the Centennial, which is the closest thing you can get to being inside a modern diesel locomotive cab. I think the point of this little area between the two prime movers was so that crew could get access. There aren't any doors or anything in it. But these little wedges have a cap on them, so I think they were used to fill with sand. On the side of the trucks is this re-railing wedge. DD40AX was the only diesel to have 8-wheel trucks. On display behind the Centennial is Union Pacific Fruit Express reefer number 458266. It was donated in about 2010. This is how the reefer looked in its final days before preservation. Too bad they didn't repaint the Union Pacific Fruit Express lettering. There was also this depot from Hershey, Nebraska, but I didn't get a chance to go inside it. There's also this restored two-way signal, some carts, and this brick Union Pacific sign. Now we go inside the baggage cart to see the artifacts inside of here, like this train bulletin. I have no idea what year this article is from, because in 1969, 844 was numbered 8444, I believe. This is a pretty cool picture of the Golden Spike ceremony. That light reflection makes it look like the moon. I have no idea when this picture was taken. I'm kinda surprised that this model isn't in a clear glass box. That's why I've seen other models of this size displayed in. I don't think this is a track plan of Bailey Yard here in North Platte, Nebraska. But that's definitely an aerial view of Bailey Yard in North Platte, Nebraska. They also include this builder's photo of Union Pacific 3977. Here's an example of that car track barcode system that I was talking about earlier. This is a children's menu from a Union Pacific dining car. This weird device here was for flipping the rail over. This section of the turntable rail is much flatter and shorter than the standard rail. This is a neat painting of both surviving Challengers. There's not too many of these surviving old railroad bikes. Most surviving railroad bikes are newer construction for 2 or 4 people. I like how these old railroad wrenches look so cartoony. This is also a nice display of a car bearing that's taken off of the truck and the wheel. There's quite a lot of pressure gauges here. It seems like these HO scale model trains on display were just put together pretty quickly. Meaning they're just basic off-the-shelf models that aren't put onto the tracks correctly. I bet this display is trying to replicate a mixed train from the 1960s. The passenger trains were so short they just put on high priority freight cars on the end. I also like that they had some technical drawings of a couple of locomotives, otherwise known as orthographic projections, or orthos for short. The picture of the engine on the left is a very rare Fairbanks Morse Erie built, which was built in Erie, Pennsylvania well before the Alco PA1s. Union Pacific was the only operator of a mass fleet of gas turbine freight locomotives from the 50s to the late 60s. This locomotive is Union Pacific's only coal turbine locomotive. I believe those high hood locomotives are some Baldwins, which are pretty rare. I don't think that's a Union Pacific Camelback, and I don't think any Western railroad ever used a Camelback. There are quite a few pictures of the 412-2s and some earlier classes of Challenger. This image is of Union Pacific's M10002, their third experimental diesel passenger train. The first to use a B unit, and the first to have not the entire train articulated as one. It would be cool if Union Pacific tried to replicate that photo again, but instead of that switcher is 4014. I believe this sketch was made in 1984 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the M10000. I had no idea the roundhouse even had a whistle. I wonder what it sounded like. Pretty deeper than a big boy whistle. This was the only good picture I've got of some station benches inside the baggage car. Now we move on to the mail car. This area here was for storing larger shipments of mail. The interior of this mail car is unusually quiet. Usually the mail car was a pretty busy place. Back in the 1950s and 60s, the mail car was the only place you could really conceal carry. I like how nicely restored this mail car interior is, and the floor isn't very dirty because lots of people must have walked through here. Usually during operation, all the mail bags are in place to prevent letters from falling on the floor and getting lost. Before there were zip codes, the mail was sorted in by destinations where it would be unloaded. And here's how an RPO looked with the mailbag racks folded up. My grandfather worked for the railroad, and his job was to clean the railway post office cars when they were finished. I don't know if this was in the RPO or the caboose, but the sink folds down in front of the toilet. The interior of this caboose is painted in 2 different shades of green. Quite a fancy paint job for a caboose interior. I guess they're not sure if they want you to climb on the caboose or not. Notice the question marks. As we reach the end of the caboose, we reach the end of this video and the end of my Railcation 2016 series. It took me nearly 2 years to get this far to editing. Thank you for watching this video.